You've probably done this before. Spent hours trying to solve a single problem, replaying the same conversation, imagining every possible outcome, searching for one more article, one more podcast, one more YouTube video, convinced that somewhere someone has the answer you've been looking for. Yet the harder you think, the further the answer seems to drift away. And then, almost by accident, something strange happens. You step outside. No plan, no notebook, no intention of solving anything. You simply begin to walk. 10 minutes later, an idea appears. A decision suddenly feels obvious. A weight you've carried for days becomes lighter. It almost feels as though the answer wasn't created, it was remembered. But why? How can something as ordinary as walking succeed where hours of concentrated thinking fail? For thousands of years, some of history's greatest minds shared one surprisingly simple habit. Not because they wanted exercise, not because they cared about burning calories, but because they understood something we have almost forgotten. Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote, "All truly great thoughts are conceived while walking." At first, it sounds poetic, perhaps even romantic. But what if he wasn't speaking metaphorically? What if walking doesn't distract us from thinking? What if it is one of the very ways human beings were designed to think? Today, science is beginning to confirm what philosophers, artists, scientists, and writers seemed to know centuries ago. The body doesn't interrupt the mind. It awakens it. And perhaps the greatest mistake of modern life isn't that we don't think enough. It's that we try to think while remaining completely still. From the moment we enter school, we learn a silent lesson. Thinking happens while sitting. The smarter the work, the quieter the room. Rows of desks, libraries, meeting rooms, office chairs, computer screens. Almost every place associated with intelligence asks the same thing from us. Sit down, stay still, focus harder. If you struggle to solve a problem, the solution is usually presented as more concentration, more information, more effort. Rarely does anyone suggest something as simple as leaving the room and going for a walk. And yet, for nearly all of human history, this would have sounded absurd, because our ancestors didn't separate thinking from movement. They couldn't. Long before there were classrooms or offices, human beings spent their lives moving through forests, mountains, rivers, and open plains. Every important decision happened while walking. Where to find food, which path to follow, when to fight, when to run. Movement wasn't a break from thinking. Movement was the environment in which thinking evolved. Our brains were never designed inside buildings. They were shaped by landscapes. Perhaps that's why stillness sometimes feels so unnatural. Not because rest is wrong, but because remaining physically motionless for hours while demanding constant mental performance is something evolution never truly prepared us for. Centuries later, some remarkable people seem to understand this instinctively. Not through neuroscience, not through brain scans, simply through experience. Jean-Jacques Rousseau admitted that he could only truly think while walking. The moment he stopped moving, his thoughts became trapped. Søren Kierkegaard wandered through the streets of Copenhagen almost every day, believing that no problem remained impossible after a sufficiently long walk. Henry David Thoreau disappeared into forests, convinced that nature revealed truths civilization often concealed. Charles Darwin built what became known as his thinking path, a simple walking route around his home that he returned to again and again whenever he wrestled with difficult ideas. Even Immanuel Kant, famous for his almost impossible discipline, walked the same route every single afternoon with such precision that neighbors reportedly adjusted their clocks by his passing. Different centuries, different countries, different philosophies, yet the same quiet ritual: walk. Then there was Albert Einstein. When people imagine Einstein, they picture equations covering blackboards, a lonely genius sitting behind a desk. But those who knew him described something different. He loved long walks. When he reached the limits of calculation, he often left his workspace behind, not because he was giving up, but because somewhere between one step and the next, complicated problems began arranging themselves into something simpler. It is tempting to dismiss these stories as charming coincidences. After all, great thinkers probably walked because everyone walked more in those days. But then an uncomfortable question appears. What if this pattern isn't a coincidence at all? What if some of the greatest minds in history kept returning to the same simple habit because it genuinely changed the way they thought? For centuries, nobody could answer that question. Today, we finally can. For centuries, these stories were little more than fascinating anecdotes. A philosopher who loved to walk, a scientist who solved problems on long strolls, a composer carrying a notebook through the woods. Interesting, but impossible to prove. Then neuroscience began asking a simple question. What actually happens inside the brain when we walk? The answer was surprising. Walking doesn't simply move the body. It changes the way the brain works. One of the most well-known studies conducted at Stanford University found that people consistently became significantly more creative while walking compared to sitting still. It didn't require running a marathon or an intense workout. Even an ordinary walk was enough to help participants generate more original ideas. Suddenly, Nietzsche's words no longer sounded like poetry. They sounded like observation. Scientists also discovered that movement increases the release of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF, a protein often described as fertilizer for the brain. It supports learning, strengthens existing neural connections, and helps create new ones. In other words, movement prepares the brain to adapt, remember, and solve problems more effectively. At the same time, regular walking improves blood flow and oxygen delivery throughout the brain, especially to areas responsible for memory, attention, and decision-making. But perhaps the most fascinating discovery involves something called the default mode network. Ironically, this network becomes active not when we're focused on a task, but when we stop forcing ourselves to focus. It comes alive during quiet moments, during daydreaming, during reflection, and remarkably often, while walking. This is the network believed to connect distant memories, process emotions, and link ideas that previously seemed unrelated. It explains why solutions often appear out of nowhere. Not because the brain suddenly starts working, but because it never stopped. It simply needed space. Think about the last time you had a genuinely good idea. Was it while staring at your inbox? During your 10th meeting of the day? Or did it arrive in the shower? While driving? Or during a quiet walk with no destination? Most of us have experienced this. We just rarely stop to ask why. Perhaps this is why Einstein didn't walk away from his work. He walked deeper into it. His body changed the conditions under which his mind could think. And maybe that's something we've forgotten. We often imagine the brain as a computer. Feed it enough information, and eventually it will produce the answer. But the brain isn't a machine separated from the body. It is part of the body. Every heartbeat, every breath, every step, they all influence the way we think. In other words, your body doesn't merely carry your mind. It helps create it. Perhaps the real value of walking was never creativity. It was clarity. Today, we rarely allow ourselves to simply walk. The moment we step outside, we reach for our headphones, a podcast, a playlist, a notification, another voice filling every moment of silence. Maybe we've become so afraid of being alone with our thoughts that we've forgotten our thoughts were never the enemy. Some answers can't be found by searching harder. They can only be found by creating enough silence to hear them. And sometimes, that silence begins with something as ordinary as a single step. So the next time life feels overwhelming, don't ask yourself what else you should read, or watch, or listen to. Instead, ask yourself one simple question. When was the last time I went for a walk with nothing but my own thoughts? You might discover that the answer you've been chasing was never waiting on another screen. It was waiting just beyond your front door. If this video made you see walking a little differently, I'd really appreciate it if you left a like. It helps the channel reach more people who enjoy philosophy, psychology, and timeless ideas like these. If you'd like to explore more videos that connect ancient wisdom with modern science, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. And let me ask you one final question. Have you ever solved a problem simply by going for a walk? I'd genuinely love to read your experience in the comments. Until next time, keep questioning, keep walking, and take good care of yourself.